To really dig into that, I want to take you to Matthew 13:24, and I want to read for you the beginning of the parable that Jesus gives that we call the wheat and the tares, but I don't yet want to read the interpretation. I want to do it much like we did the parable from last night. I want to read it the way Jesus presents it, sort of bullet fire points of just this agricultural illustration, and then we'll run into the meaning in just a little bit. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. Tares, by the way, is a word we don't really use much, so I just want to stop right here and illustrate this before we give Jesus' definition of what the tares are. We don't even understand the word tares, but that would be closer to our word for weed or a wild grass, all right? And so I just want to explain that so that we're not lost. Some things get lost in translation easily. That's one of them. And so someone comes in and sows weeds among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares or the weeds or the wild grass also appeared. And by the way, there is a reference in the Greek syntax that this weed is actually a weed that looks much like wheat. So it's very indistinguishable from the wheat. It's not just a grass that's opposite of the wheat. It's a grass that looks much like the wheat. Very hard to tell the difference between the wheat and the tare. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, An enemy has done this. The servant said to him, Do you want us then to go out and gather them up? But he said, No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now, I didn't give you any much interpretation other than just try to explain the word tares, which is a little bit lost on us in modern English. So tried to clean that up a little bit. I didn't give you any theological interpretation to this parable. Some of it kind of seems straightforward and obvious, and you might be jogging your good old Bible memory now and remembering this story and where this story ends. But I just want to present a little bit of our interpretations before we get into Jesus' interpretation. And some of our interpretation is that we always kind of land at the end of this and get excited about the moment when the reapers come to separate the wheat and the tares. And a lot of these moments when we hear stories about the good next to the bad, the wheat next to a weed, all we think about is the end of the story in which the weeds finally get what's coming to them. And so our interpretation sort of jumps to the end of the story so that we can celebrate the darkness, so that we can say, hey, the world's going bad, but God's going to come and do something good in the middle of the wheat and the tare story. I want you to know that in some ways this text is partly fulfilled. I do believe this is an eschatological text. Eschatology is a big theology word that means last days. So when you hear someone say, what's your eschatology? That means what's your theory about how this thing ends, right? Which, by the way, is a huge topic in almost every church. How's this thing end? And we talk about how this thing ends way more than we talk about beginnings. I mean, it's like we are obsessed with the end in the church. But a lot of what we're calling the end when we read the New Testament was the end to the system they were living in that day. And so in some ways, parables like the wheat and the tares had their fulfillment at the end of the Mosaic age, in which the old Mosaic economy called the law passed away. The temple came down, and with it, sacrificial systems came down, and the priestly system came down, and the entire Mosaic system came down, and all we're left with is Christ is the only one left on the field. And so in some ways, these are scriptures that have their fulfillment in our past. But the presence of the principles in the story are not in our past. They are very much in our present, and here's how we know. Because there's evil in the world, because there are weeds among our wheat, there are still presence on the planet that shows us that it's not all good. Again, you don't have to look very far to figure out that it's not all good. And so therefore, a parable like the wheat and the tares makes a lot of sense. It also shows us that some things are just out of our control. God, in the story, the master of the field plants good wheat, and then something else comes in and plants the weeds. And so this story lets us know that not everything is our fault, and not everything is in our control. Sometimes we like to put guilt on the church and to say that if we were doing our job, if you were fasting enough or praying enough or the church was as powerful as they should be, there wouldn't be any sin in your town. You wouldn't have this crime problem you have. We love to say stuff like, you want to know why our kids are running the streets? You want to know why there are drug addicts? It's because they can't find hope in the church. The parable of the wheat and the tares says otherwise. You plant good wheat in the field, something comes along and plants weeds. I don't care how much you fast. I don't care how much you pray. I don't care how powerful your sermons are. There's just going to be bad stuff happen in the world. Now, that's not a cop-out to say, well, the church, forget it, who cares? I mean, the devil's going to do what he does anyway. But it's also to take a little bit of the stress off of you. You are not meant to change the world. I know we love world changer language. We love it in the church. We love to say, hey, come on in here, we'll make you world changers. You know what world you are in charge of changing? Yours. The one you live in. Change your relationship, change your marriage, change the way you think, change your body, change your mind, change your attitude, change your discipline. You can't change your neighbors, you probably can't change your kids, but you can change yours. So get busy. If you don't do that, that's on you. But you don't change the city, you don't change the state, you don't change the country, and you don't change the culture. And the wheat and the tares tells you that no matter how good you sow wheat, somebody's going to come along and sow some weeds. So relax a little bit. It's not your job to change the entire world around you.